Spring in the countryside was supposed to be quiet, fresh blossoms on the trees, long evenings lit by orange sunsets, and the faint hum of crickets returning after winter. When Claire moved back to her parents' farmhouse to help her mother recover from surgery, she welcomed the idea of isolation. The farmhouse sat on a slope overlooking a broad field that had not been plowed in years. The grass grew wild there, tall enough to ripple like waves whenever the wind swept across. On her second night, as she stood at the kitchen window, she noticed something odd. A patch of the grass swayed against the wind's direction, as though something unseen moved within it. She brushed it off as her nerves adjusting to the silence. City life had conditioned her to traffic and streetlights, not the absolute stillness of rural nights. But around midnight, a sound broke through the quiet, an irregular thumping, like boots striking earth in a slow, dragging rhythm. Claire opened her bedroom window and leaned out. The moonlight silvered the field, showing only the tall grass, but she swore she could hear the sound getting closer, only to stop suddenly when she whispered, "Hello?" Her skin prickled as though the night itself had leaned in to listen. The next morning, her mother mentioned hearing someone pacing outside her window, too, but insisted it must have been an animal. Claire knew better. She had grown up here, foxes didn't walk in patterns, and deer didn't stop and start as though they were listening. That afternoon, she decided to check the field. The grass was thick and damp from the morning dew, brushing cold against her jeans. A few steps in, she noticed the blades were bent, flattened into a strange path that curved in a wide arc toward the tree line. It wasn't random trampling, it looked deliberate, like someone had dragged their feet back and forth. That night, the sound returned, this time closer, heavier, and unmistakably human. Claire sat frozen in bed as the steps circled the farmhouse. Every so often, the pacing stopped directly beneath her window. She held her breath, straining to hear even the smallest sound, but all that came was silence, thick, pressing silence that made her ears ring. She finally gathered the courage to peek through the blinds. Her heart leapt into her throat. In the field, standing just at the edge of the moonlight, was a tall figure, completely still, as though waiting for her to acknowledge it. Dawn. When she dared to look again, the figure was gone, but the grass directly in front of the house was flattened in a perfect circle. Claire didn't tell her mother. Something in her gut warned her that speaking of it aloud would make it worse, more real, as if it wanted to be known. But she couldn't shake the thought. Spring had only just begun, and something was waking in the fields with it. The following day, Claire couldn't shake the image of the flattened circle in front of the house. It wasn't the kind of mark left by children playing, nor an animal bedding down. The edges were too sharp, too intentional, as though someone had walked in a perfect loop again and again through the night. She spent the morning pacing the kitchen, every creak of the old floorboards beneath her feet echoing her unease. When her mother asked what was wrong, Claire forced a smile and claimed she was just restless from the isolation. But deep down, she knew that wasn't it. She felt watched. Around noon, she decided to return to the field. The sun was bright, the sky clear, and the safety of daylight gave her a false courage. She stepped carefully along the flattened path until she reached the circle. Standing in the center, she felt something strange, a quiet heaviness in the air, almost as though the world outside the ring was still, muted. The grass here was pressed nearly to the soil, spiraling inward like the mark of something weighty having turned in place. She crouched down and brushed her hand across the soil. It wasn't just flattened. It was damp, slick, almost as if something had been sweating into the earth. That night, Claire resolved to stay awake and catch whoever was trespassing. She brewed coffee and sat in her bedroom with the lights off, staring through the blinds. Midnight stretched into 1 a.m., and then she heard it, the dragging footsteps again, circling steadily around the farmhouse. Her pulse quickened as the sound came closer, heavier than before, each step accompanied by the faint rasp of something brushing against the siding. She clutched her phone, her thumb hovering over 911, but something told her calling wouldn't help. This wasn't someone who feared the police. She leaned forward, barely breathing, and through the narrow slit in the blinds, she saw movement. The tall figure was there again, pacing slowly across the circle. Its movements were unnerving, too precise, like someone practicing the same ritual step over and over. The figure didn't stumble, didn't pause, and yet at times its legs seemed too long for its body, stretching and contracting unnaturally in the moonlight. Claire's throat went dry as the figure stopped mid-step and turned its head toward her window. Even from that distance, she felt the weight of its gaze. Suddenly, the house fell into absolute silence. The night insects stopped buzzing, even the wind seemed to have died. Claire froze, realizing with horror that she could still hear the footsteps, slow, deliberate thuds, but now they were inside the house. Claire's heart thudded so violently she thought it might echo through the walls. She sat frozen at her bedroom window, straining to listen. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, wood creaking under pressure, one step at a time, coming from the hallway outside her door. She pressed her hand over her mouth, forcing herself to breathe quietly. Her phone shook in her hand, but she didn't dare turn it on. Even the faint glow of the screen might reveal her hiding spot. The old farmhouse carried sound strangely. A dropped spoon in the kitchen could ring clear into the upstairs bedrooms, but these footsteps didn't seem to belong to anyone solid. They were heavy, yes, but hollow, like something walking in boots filled with water. She prayed her mother wouldn't wake and call out, giving herself away. The steps reached the top of the staircase, paused, and then began again, closer, until Claire knew whatever it was stood right outside her door. Her breath caught as the doorknob trembled, not in a quick twist, but in a slow, patient turn, as though whoever, or whatever, was on the other side wanted to savor the moment. She backed up against the wall, gripping her phone like a weapon, though she knew it was useless. The knob stopped halfway. Silence filled the space between them, broken only by the creak of the floorboards shifting under invisible weight. Then, just as suddenly, the footsteps moved away, receding down the hall until the house went still again. When dawn broke, Claire forced herself out into the hallway. The floorboards where she had heard the footsteps groaned under her weight, but nothing else seemed disturbed. She almost convinced herself it was a dream, until she noticed the marks. Thin, dark streaks ran along the baseboards, smudges like something wet had been dragged against the walls. She crouched and touched one with her fingertip. It wasn't dirt. It was sticky. Dried, like blood. All day she wrestled with the thought of telling her mother, but decided against it. If she admitted out loud what she had seen and heard, she feared she'd lose control of the fragile thread keeping her sane. That night, she tried to convince herself to sleep, pulling the blankets up to her chin. But as her eyelids grew heavy, she heard it again, the steady, dragging steps, but this time, they weren't in the hallway. They were directly beneath her bed. Claire didn't move. Her entire body went rigid as the weight beneath her bed shifted. The dragging sound grew louder, like fingernails raking against the wooden floor. She pressed her back into the headboard, clutching the blanket like a shield, terrified that if she looked down, she would see something staring back at her. For what felt like an eternity, the sound crawled from one side of the bed to the other, circling, as though whatever was down there knew she was listening. Her instinct screamed at her to run, but her legs refused to obey. Instead, she forced herself to reach for her phone. With trembling fingers, she tapped the flashlight on. The thin beam of light spilled across the floor. Slowly, she leaned over the edge of the bed and aimed the phone downward. For a split second, the light caught movement, something pale and jointed folding itself deeper into the shadows. It scuttled back, impossibly fast, until the sound of its scraping vanished into the walls. Claire scrambled from her bed, her breath ragged. She dropped to her knees, shining the light under the frame, but nothing was there, not a speck of dust disturbed, not even the smear marks she had seen earlier in the hallway. She sat back, shaking. It hadn't been her imagination. Something had been under there, something too large to hide yet somehow able to vanish completely. The following morning, she finally broke her silence and asked her mother if she'd ever noticed anything unusual in the house. Her mother hesitated before answering, which unsettled her even more. She admitted that sometimes, when the house was quiet in spring, she'd hear scratching in the walls, like mice, but heavier, more deliberate. Claire's stomach dropped as her mother said it casually, as though it were no more than a nuisance. If she only knew what Claire had seen the night before. That evening, Claire avoided her room. Instead, she made a bed on the living room couch, hoping the hum of the refrigerator and the faint glow of the lamp would make her feel safer. But as she began to drift into uneasy sleep, she heard the footsteps again. Only this time, they didn't pace outside, nor in the hall. They rose up from beneath the floorboards, traveling steadily across the living room, right toward her. Claire sat upright on the couch, every nerve in her body straining toward the sound beneath her. The boards creaked softly, as though something heavy shifted just inches below. Then, without warning, one of the floorboards in front of her bowed inward, bending under pressure. Dust sifted up into the air. She froze, staring at the spot as her pulse hammered in her ears. A long pause, then, crack. The wood splintered. Something pale forced its way between the boards. Groping blindly toward the light, she let out a stifled gasp. The hand, or what resembled a hand, was wrong. Its fingers were far too long, knotted at the joints, the skin stretched thin and almost translucent, like wet paper. It flexed once, twitching as if testing the air, then slid back down beneath the floor with an insect-like quickness. Claire's entire body trembled. That thing had been under her room, her bed, and now her living space. There was no denying it anymore. Something lived in the walls and beneath the floorboards of her family's farmhouse. At dawn, she searched the spot where she'd seen the hand. The board was cracked but intact, the floor beneath dark and damp with something that smelled faintly metallic. She pressed her hand against the surface. It was cold, almost clammy, like the residue of something freshly pulled away. She thought about tearing the board up, proving to herself there was nothing underneath, but the image of that hand stopped her. If she opened it, she might not like what was staring back. That day dragged endlessly. She couldn't focus on helping her mother, couldn't eat, couldn't sit still. Every creak of the house set her on edge. The farmhouse had always been old, noisy with its shifting beams and settling pipes, but now every sound felt intentional, calculated. As she stood at the kitchen sink rinsing dishes, she swore she heard a faint whisper behind the walls, like breath moving through the wood. Her chest tightened as she leaned closer, pressing her ear against the paneling. She could just barely make out words, whispered low and steady, "You see me." That night, she locked her bedroom door for the first time. She sat upright in bed, clutching the flashlight, staring at the cracks along the floor where the boards met. Hours passed, every shadow shifting with the moonlight. Then, around 3 in the morning, the boards bowed again. Slowly, silently, the long, jointed hand rose from the darkness, this time followed by a sliver of its face. Pale, stretched skin, and a single eye glistening like wet glass, locked directly on hers. Claire didn't sleep after that night. She sat with her back pressed to the headboard until dawn, the flashlight clutched so tightly her hand ached. Every time the floor creaked, every time the wind shifted against the siding, she expected to see that pale face rising again from the cracks. But when daylight came, everything looked normal. Her mother hummed in the kitchen, birds called from the trees, and for a fleeting moment, Claire convinced herself she was unraveling. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe grief and isolation were feeding her imagination, but the illusion didn't last. That afternoon, while folding laundry in her old bedroom, she heard it again, whispers slipping through the walls. They were clearer now, layered like several voices speaking at once, some too low to hear, others almost hissing. She pressed her ear to the plaster. The voices stilled. Then, faint and sharp, one voice broke through, "We know you." Claire dropped the laundry and stumbled back, her hands shaking. The whisper didn't follow her this time. It didn't need to. The message was clear, they weren't hiding anymore. Desperation clawed at her. She thought about calling her father, who lived 2 towns over, but what would she say? That something lived in the house? That it spoke from the walls? He'd think she was losing her mind. Even worse, what if it wasn't her imagination, and by telling him, she dragged him into it too? That night she tried to distract herself, leaving the TV on in the living room and curling up on the couch. For a while, the noise helped. Until the screen flickered. At first, she assumed it was static, old wiring, maybe. But then the image bent, stretched into warped shadows. On the screen, for only a second, appeared a pale face with that same glassy, unblinking eye, staring straight into the camera as though it knew she was watching. The TV went black. The house lights cut out. She sat frozen in the dark, listening as the footsteps began again, this time not just pacing, but moving with intent, circling closer, until she swore they stopped just behind the couch. Her breath hitched. She didn't dare turn around. But then, cold air brushed the back of her neck, and in the silence, she heard it, low, almost gentle, right against her ear, "Claire." By morning, Claire was done pretending she could endure another night. She packed a duffel bag with clothes, her laptop, and her phone charger, all the while avoiding her mother's questions. She muttered something about visiting her father for a few days and ignored the flicker of relief that crossed her mother's face. Deep down, she wondered if her mother knew more than she admitted, if she too had lived with the whispers but had learned to bury them. The sky was overcast as Claire carried her bag to the old pickup parked by the barn. The air smelled damp, heavy, as though a storm lingered just out of sight. She shoved the bag onto the passenger seat and climbed in, gripping the wheel with trembling hands. As soon as she turned the key, the engine sputtered, caught, then died. She tried again. Nothing. A cold bead of sweat slid down her spine. The truck had never failed her before. Frustrated, she got out and headed toward the narrow gravel road that led to the highway. Maybe she could walk, flag down a passing car. But the further she went, the quieter the world became. The birds that had been chirping minutes before fell silent. Even the wind stilled, the fields of grass standing eerily still, like they were holding their breath. And then she noticed something ahead on the road. At first, it looked like a fallen branch. But as she drew closer, her heart dropped. It was a circle, tall grass, bent flat and pressed into the gravel itself, as though the field had spilled over onto the road. She stumbled back, nearly tripping on the uneven stones. The circle was identical to the one she'd seen in the field, its edges too precise, the center spiraling inward. As she stood staring, the silence deepened until she heard it again, the dragging footsteps. But this time, they weren't behind her. They came from inside the circle, as though something invisible was walking in place, turning, waiting for her to step closer. Claire bolted, sprinting back to the farmhouse, lungs burning, gravel scattering under her feet. She didn't stop until she slammed the front door behind her, locking it twice. Her mother appeared in the hallway, alarmed, but before Claire could explain, a deep groan echoed through the house. The walls trembled, dust falling from the beams, as though the farmhouse itself had taken a long, shuddering breath. After the house shuddered, Claire finally broke down and told her mother everything. The footsteps, the whispers, the pale hand pushing through the floorboards. She expected disbelief, maybe anger, but instead, her mother grew quiet. She sat at the kitchen table, fingers trembling around a chipped mug of tea. "I thought it was only me," she whispered. "I prayed you'd never notice." Her mother explained that when she was a child, her own father had forbidden her from entering the fields in spring. He never explained why, only said the land was older than the farmhouse, older than the family itself. But she remembered lying awake on April nights, hearing the same dragging footsteps outside her window. Once, she swore she saw a man standing in the circle, tall and still, his skin pale in the moonlight. When she told her father, he slapped her and told her never to speak of it again. "Some things," he said, "should be ignored, or they grow hungry." Claire's blood ran cold. All this time, her mother had lived with the same nightmare and kept silent, convinced denial was protection. But Claire had looked. She had acknowledged it. And deep down, she knew, that was what had drawn it closer. Her mind raced back to the first night in the kitchen, when she whispered hello into the dark field. That had been her mistake. She'd answered it. Before Claire could respond, a heavy thud echoed through the ceiling. Both women looked up at once. A trail of dust drifted down from the beams, settling across the kitchen table. The footsteps began again, this time running, heavy and relentless, across the upstairs floorboards. Then silence. The house groaned, wood stretching as though under immense weight. Her mother gripped her wrist, voice trembling. "We should never have stayed here this long." Claire opened her mouth to ask what she meant, but before she could, every cupboard door in the kitchen burst open at once, slamming against the walls, dishes crashing to the floor. The air grew ice cold. From somewhere deep within the farmhouse, inside the walls, came a low, inhuman laugh. The crash of the cupboard still echoed when the walls began to groan again, long and low, like the timbers were exhaling. Claire grabbed her mother's arm and pulled her toward the front door, fumbling with the locks. But when she twisted the handle, the door refused to open. She shoved harder, the old hinges rattling, but it was like pushing against stone. The house didn't want to let them leave. The temperature dropped further, their breath misting in the air. The whispers returned, louder now, overlapping and frantic, spilling from the walls and floorboards. Some words were indecipherable, but others cut sharp and clear. "Stay. Stay. Stay." Her mother cried out and stumbled back, clutching her chest as the sound swelled, vibrating the very glass panes in the windows. Claire spun toward the living room, searching for something, anything, that might break a window, but before she could act, the floor buckled beneath her feet. She fell hard, catching herself on the edge of the couch as the boards splintered open. From the jagged gap, pale limbs writhed upward, not one, but several, jointed and twitching, pushing into the room like spiders forcing themselves from a nest. Each hand was too long, too thin, the fingers curling and uncurling blindly. Her mother screamed as one of the hands grasped the leg of the table and snapped it clean in half like dry twigs. Claire yanked her mother toward the staircase. If they couldn't get out, they had to get higher, away from whatever was crawling through the floor. They stumbled up the steps as the hands clawed and scraped after them, the house rattling violently, windows shattering one by one as though from the force of a storm outside. But there was no storm. The sky beyond the glass was unervingly clear, the fields still and silent. All the chaos came from within. They reached the upstairs hallway, the boards trembling under their feet. Behind them, a massive crack split through the living room ceiling, plaster raining down. Something was rising through the house, forcing itself upward. Claire dragged her mother into her bedroom, slammed the door, and pressed her back against it. For a moment, there was silence. Then the whispers condensed into a single, unified voice, deep and resonant, rattling the walls. "You invited me." Claire pressed her back hard against the bedroom door, feeling it tremble under an unseen weight. Her mother clung to her arm, whispering prayers under her breath, each word swallowed by the low hum of the farmhouse walls. The voice came again, this time closer, shaking the room. "You see me now." The floor vibrated, boards cracking as though something vast and heavy moved beneath them. Claire's flashlight beam darted across the walls, catching hairline fissures spidering outward. The house was breaking apart from the inside. With no time to think, she dragged her mother to the window. The drop was steep, a full story onto hard earth, but it was the only way out. She fumbled with the latch, heart racing. Behind them, the door bulged inward, the wood warping as pale, jointed fingers pressed through the cracks, stretching toward them. Claire shoved the window up, grabbed her mother's trembling hands, and together they heaved themselves into the night air. They landed hard in the damp grass, rolling onto their backs just as the house erupted with noise, crashing timber, splintering glass, and a howl that seemed to rise from the very earth beneath it. Claire pulled her mother to her feet and staggered across the field. When she dared to look back, her breath caught. In the upstairs window where they'd stood moments ago, a figure loomed in silhouette, impossibly tall, with too many arms unfurling against the glass. It watched them go, unmoving, unhurried, as though confident it had all the time in the world. They didn't stop running until they reached the gravel road. The farmhouse still stood behind them, eerily still now, as though nothing had happened. Not a single board was broken, not a single window shattered. Only the dark circle in the field remained, bent grass spiraling inward, glowing faintly under the moonlight like a wound that never healed. Her mother clutched her hand, whispering, "Don't look back." Claire obeyed, though she felt its gaze burning into her spine until the road carried them far away. In the years that followed, Claire never set foot on that land again. The farmhouse was eventually abandoned, left to rot in the spring rains. But sometimes, late at night in her city apartment, she would wake to a sound she prayed she'd left behind, slow, dragging footsteps circling her bed. And always, just before dawn, a whisper curling from the walls, "You invited me."